Hello, YouTube. My name is Philip on Water. My real name is Philip Lebsack, and I co-authored the book with this other person you're seeing now, James T. Doliman. James, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. So, James, our new book, The Orthodox Understanding, we've gotten some feedback, and I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit with you today. One thing that I feel like I've noticed is it seems like people are talking over each other sometimes. Whenever I talk with other people about the book, usually people are bringing up certain scriptures. Like they'll say, but this understanding you have can't be right because Paul said this, or the gospel says this, or the New Testament says this. But the book is about those very scriptures and their interpretation. So it's like we're talking over each other. So to give you an example, like people aren't even reading the book. They're just coming to us and saying, well, Paul said in Ephesians, or he said in Romans, the gospel is that you're saved by grace through faith, not by works of the law. Well, that's exactly the point of the book is what do those terms mean? Like what does grace mean? What does faith mean? What does works of the law mean? All those things have to be properly interpreted. And apparently it's not as clear as what some people think it is. Apparently those things are not understood by people who are reading the Bible in English, which is why we wrote the book, and whenever you understand the original languages and what they're actually communicating, and you understand the ancient culture, and you understand some of the things about the background in the first century, and of Paul's background and so forth, this type of thing, you realize that the understanding of the text is in some ways radically different than what you think the text means today in your modern English Bible. So, for instance, the gospel saying that we're saved by grace through faith, not by works, actually means we're saved by God's graciousness, His benevolent character, through faithfulness, through works, not through mental assent or belief just in your mind, but by your faithfulness, your actual works, which is what pistis means in Greek.
Yes.
And then the works of the law, we've come to the realization that is actually a technical term that Paul uses to refer to a specific part of the law, not the whole law. He's not referring to being a moralist or or doing good works in general, which is what the reformers thought. He's actually just referring to the laws that make a Jew a Jew, that distinguishes the Jewish people, like circumcision, like the Sabbath, like food laws. Whereas the other laws, the moral laws, Jesus actually made those more difficult to keep. That's what we find in Irenaeus, right? So
Yes.
it seems like so this is, these are the very reasons why we wrote the book, is because you have to unpack all those words and all the background to actually understand the text. But it seems like people are talking over us. They're just eisegeting things into the text and then just spewing that out back at us rather than
Yes.
actually dealing with our claims. Like I rarely see in my interactions people actually trying to counter my claim and argue against the claim itself. Nobody's trying to provide evidence for my claim, which is that the works of the law doesn't mean a technical term that's referring to a specific law or something like this. Rather, they're just giving us more eisegesis from different scriptures, which isn't really helping. So that has been what I've found since I uploaded the promo about a week ago. What do you think about that? What are your
Well,
thoughts? Have
I
you had
think
any interaction with people about this yet? And how do you feel about that?
I have a couple of readers. They have some feedback on this, but we haven't talked in detail. We need to make arrangement for that. But I think the kind of phenomena you've encountered is really like, to begin with, people have a presupposition of what gospel is. Like they already thought like that is the gospel. If you don't have that, then you don't have the gospel. Well, interestingly, if you read the book of Gospels, the book of Gospels says nothing about the things they usually think what Gospels are. So the Gospels are like the idea of a gospel, the good news, is not like a good news in general. It's not some news that is good. It's a military tiding. So without the military nuance of this specific term, I don't think people properly understand what gospel is, and then try to read all kinds of things into the idea, and then apply this idea to all kinds of, let's say, minor good newses in the New Testament. For example, God's graciousness, God's gifts, and these are all good. These are all like lowercase good newses, but they are not the good news. They are not the cosmic military victory tiding that's about the victory of Christ over all the opposing power, all the evil powers in the world, in the cosmos, in the spiritual and physical world. So without understanding the very idea of what gospel is, it is very easy for people to read all kinds of good things into the idea of what gospel is. I think that's what like where people started to get wrong, and they feel like there's no, like, for many people, like there's no debate what gospel is. It must be about salvation. It must be about we're getting to into heaven. But no, that's not what gospel is. That's the consequence of the gospel, and people don't realize this. They put all the kind of good things into the good news, and that's not exactly what's going on there. So I think these concepts, those, like the fundamental ideas like these, are the first things that we like. I think in our interaction with people, we want to set these things out first and tell people that's what we are talking about. It's not what we are like. We're not saying that no, you're not going to heaven if you like, if you like try to establish your own righteousness. Of course, our salvation comes from God's graciousness. It's not our own, like we are not establishing our own righteousness. Of course, that's true, and also like it's not that you don't have to believe, like there's no intellectual assent at all. That's not the case either. But the point is that that's not what gospel is. That's not what faith is. That's not what works are. So we want to lay out those fundamental ideas first before we actually can get into those topics. And that's where, like, I think why you have encountered so many like people talking over us, things like that.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's kind of hard to do the work we're trying to do, because like you said, it's where we're trying to lay down some fundamental ideas, and it's those very fundamental ideas that people presume. And so they already start thinking, oh, I don't need this because I already know what the gospel says because it says this, but they don't realize that they're reading into it something, right? I guess I should have started with this question, but next question is, why did you want to write this book?
Well, I want to write this book because, well, I think we want to write this book because we want to, first of all, present our own journey from a Protestant background to the Orthodoxy, and that journey is not necessarily like Of course, it's an experience. It's spiritual in many ways. We went to church. We talked to the priests. We have a lot of wonderful spiritual experiences. We talked to the bishop and people like that, and that's a part of it. But a more important part of it, I should say, the majority part of our journey is the intellectual part, because we are sort of like we are students in the seminary. We were students in the seminary, and we try to figure out things. We try to learn things, and the things we've learned, we realize that that the more we learn, the more we realize that how to say, what we thought
we're kind
was
of
true.
bridging a gap, right? We're
Right,
doing
right.
something that hasn't really been done before, right?
Right.
Because if you want to, anybody could just access the church fathers, the Orthodox church fathers, and you could read their works. You could access the works of the church online. A lot of them are available now. You could find out what the tradition is and what the church fathers say and believe, but it seems like there is a missing link in terms of the study of these things when it comes to connecting the tradition with the scholarly world, in terms of like the study of the original languages and the ancient Near Eastern culture studies and this type of thing, which is what really we've been doing, right? Which is more of our academic interest. And so
That's right.
we have in our studies found the connection. And so basically everything that we have in our book, if you search for it diligently, anybody could find this stuff. But we're doing what other scholars normally do, which is we're connecting the dots, right? We have the dots and we've connected them for you. So you can see that, these word studies and how they relate to what the tradition teaches, and you can see the consistency.
I think one of the most important aspect of what we're doing here is that the church fathers think in a way that is different from how modern Western people would think, and we are used to, like, we as modern people, we are used to how modern people think, and we think in certain ways, we analyze things in certain ways that the church fathers did not. So it is very crucial for us to translate their understanding into how we can approach them. Like, the way they approach things is sort of too mystical, too general. When I first read church fathers in my earlier Christian years, what I realized is that they used a lot of biblical languages. They didn't explain this. They didn't analyze these terms, analyze these ideas, which was really annoying to me, because I was thinking, well, if you just quote the Bible, then you're saying nothing. You're not telling me what the text means. And that was really puzzling to me. But I think what we are doing here is to try to tell people that the reason why they quote the Bible like that and put it into the context, we realize that by quoting the text that way, that's how they understood it. And we are just giving people the background and the analysis that they didn't have, and we did the analysis for the people in the modern world, so that they can understand why the church fathers spoke in such a manner. Why did they quote the scriptures like that? Why did they quote scriptures in that specific context, which probably isn't the same to us? And so I think this is a very important bridge to build, to help people see that what scriptures actually mean in the eyes of the church fathers, in the eyes of early Christians, and even in the eyes of the apostles.
Okay. So James, what are we trying to prove here?
I think, well, from certain aspect, I think we are not really trying to prove anything. We are trying to present the conclusion we've come to through all our studies. And in many ways, those conclusions amazed us too, right? It wasn't just, I can remember the days when we've talked in our dormitory and we've talked about what is the gospel and what is sacrifice is about. Like, we are all amazed by our own studies. That's what it means. That's what it signifies. And nobody's ever told us anything like that. And of course, you can still find those materials in very like specific disciplines in academia, which honestly, like, even you could only find a handful of scholars in those areas. Like, it's too like a small an area. Like, you don't even know these like people studying ancient Near East sacrifices. Like, it's so rare. But those studies are very important. Getting to know these materials really helps us to have a deepened understanding of what Scripture is all about. And these things amazed us, and we are presenting our conclusions, and by all those comparisons, by all those studies, we compile all those materials together, and we laid it out in our own language, in our own if I can say, not a very academic way, because we want to make it approachable to many like lay people like you and I, right? So I think that's
there's academic content, but it's presented in a way that's easy to read for.
Yeah. So I think that's the first thing we do. But if we do try to prove something, what we are trying to prove is that what the Scriptures teaches is definitely not what the churches in the West has been teaching ever since the Middle Ages. Because comparing the Scriptures with all ancient writings, whether it's ancient Near East or whether it's ancient Greece or ancient Roman and ancient church fathers, compare Scriptures with all those writings, apparently they understood Scriptures very differently from how Western people will understand the Scriptures. And I'm not just talking about Protestantism. I'm also talking about the Catholicism after the Middle Ages, because after the Middle Ages, Catholicism understands Scriptures, especially in a lot of theological concepts in terms of scholasticism. Scholasticism has such a great influence on how Western people think that people don't even really realize that they've already used those methodology, those way of thinking to think about Scriptures, which is not how ancient people would think. And that fundamentally changed our perspective on the Scriptures. And we are reading Scriptures in a way that is unimaginable to the ancient people. And that if we don't use the lens of the ancient people to read Scriptures, we are not going to understand Scriptures at all. Like, we are not going to understand not only the Scriptures per se, but also like the church fathers. Like, a lot of people reading the church fathers and think, oh, then they're not saying anything special. They're not saying anything theological. Not theological in a scholastic sense, but they are saying something that is profoundly theological if you understand what they are talking about. If you understand the way they organize their speech, the way they organize their thoughts, which is very different from modern Western thoughts. So I think that's, if we are trying to prove something, I think that's exactly what we are trying to prove. And we are also claiming that those later Western interpretation of the Scriptures and the later Western way of thinking when it comes to Scriptures and theology and all these type of things are from a very traditional ecclesiastical sense heretical. They are not in line
Yeah.
with how the apostles would think about these issues. They're not in line with how early Christians would think about these issues. And they are definitely not in line with how the Eastern churches have been thinking about these issues. So yeah, I think that's what we want to like really like in the core of our book. Like that's a fundamental underlying philosophy that we are promoting, that is like behind all our analysis, because we are trying to say, if you don't understand scriptures through that mentality, you are not going to understand scriptures at all.
Right. Yeah. 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 I think you brought up a really good point there. And that's the historical problem, right? It's that you have these later historical problems that the medieval Western church was dealing with, or that that was in the forefront of their mind, and that has been carried down into the present. But those problems only go back so far. Like the concerns are clearly later.
Okay.
Something that I've noticed, and this was the case for me too, whenever I was first coming to this realization of orthodoxy, and the evidence lining up with it was, I had all these concerns in my mind about certain things, like, well, if this is the case, then what about this, or if orthodoxy teaches this, well, then what about this? So to give you a specific example, orthodoxy teaches we were saved, we're being saved, and we will be saved, but we don't know who is saved, right? Ultimately, right? That's not our call to make, and we don't know. It's the nature of demons to fall and never get up. It's the nature of angels to never fall, but it's the nature of man to fall and get back up again. And as long as we keep getting back up, we can be saved. And we're saved through our effort, through our works. Not just through mental belief. You're already supposed to believe mentally, right? That's just a small part of it. And so, one thought that went through my mind when I was first coming to the realization that we're saved through our works, was that, well, I sin all the time though, right? So how can I be saved, right? Because you're always sinning. But you have to recognize the stuff that I just said. We have to keep getting back up. We have to keep trying and work out our salvation with fear and trembling. But it's things like this. It's like it seems like there's these concerns, and some of them I think are anachronistic in the sense of they weren't concerns that the early church had, but they're concerns that we have. Like we have concerns specifically about certain things, like belief in certain doctrines that I don't think they did, or the concern is about. Or like, for example, like apologetics now is about, do you believe in Jesus, in your mind? But actually I feel like it was completely different in the ancient world, right? Because it was more about, are you being obedient to the Lord as opposed to other pagan gods, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole different way of thinking about that. But it seems like whenever I talk to people that about the book and about these things, they're coming from that Protestant perspective that I was too, and so I can kind of resonate with that. These concerns that they have about certain specific things, but their concerns are anachronistic. Again, they're concerns that we feel from a Protestant perspective, but they can only go back so far. They only go back to the Reformation, but they don't actually take you back to the focus of what the early church was actually concerned about. And so that, to give you another example, and actually we talked about this earlier today, something that came up was the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22. That is popularly taken to be a typology of Christ. Personally, I mean, I don't see a problem with that. I'm sure you probably don't see a problem with that either, but I think you and I both agree, though, that that isn't the focus, at least not from the New Testament's perspective, because the New Testament never connects the binding of Isaac with Christ. And even in the Apostolic Fathers, I did a check, and yeah, again, I think we talked about this earlier. Clement references it, and he doesn't connect it to Christ. He references it to obedience and faithfulness, which of course, that's the larger theme of his letter. Those crazy Corinthians. He's trying to keep them under the reins.
Yes.
And then Barnabas references it too, but he takes it in some mystical, some other direction. He doesn't connect it to Christ, is the point. And so it seems like that is a later concern, to connect Genesis 22 to the typology of Christ, whereas the early church, apparently they didn't need to do that, because they already had, they were already using so many typologies that they already had. And they used that passage as an example, as a moral example of faithfulness and obedience. And by extension, they were also using it as an example. I think before the church, probably, the Jews were using it as an example to show that God does not want real child sacrifice, like the pagan cults were doing, like the cult of Moloch, where they were actually sacrificing children to the heated up statue, putting it in the arms of the heated up statue of Moloch. Whereas the God of the Bible does not want child sacrifice. So in like a very basic sense, that seems to be one of the points. But in the early church fathers, the apostolic fathers specifically, their focus is on the faithfulness and obedience. Whereas today in the Protestant West, it seems like their concern is entirely different. And so whenever I talk about some of these things, that's just an example, but so whenever I talk about some of these things with people, it seems like they're holding on to these concerns. But, the question is, what was the original focus, right? The question is, what did the early church actually believe? What was their actual focus? What did they care about? Not what the reformers cared about or what we necessarily care about per se. It's what did the early church actually care about and believe, right? And so what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think
and
it's
on the binding of Isaac, how would you say we should interpret the binding of Isaac? Do you see the substitutionary atonement in the binding of Isaac?
No. I think that's very.
Why don't you see the substitutionary atonement in the binding of Isaac? Isn't it clear to you? It's so obvious. He was going to kill Isaac, and then God says no, and then the ram comes in. That's the substitute. You can't see the substitutionary atonement? Would you please explain to me and to the people why there's no substitutionary atonement there?
Well, first of all, you only see the substitutionary atonement when you have that doctrine in the first place. The early church never had the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement. Therefore, they will never see the goat as a substitution to the Isaac. They will only see it's an example of Abraham's obedience, and maybe a type for like Isaac's own binding, Isaac's own self-sacrifice probably is a type or a type or image for the future self-sacrifice of Christ, which is not in a very absolute form, because Isaac was not sacrificed ultimately. So that's like that. If that's a type, it's not a complete type. So you can only understand in a mystical way rather than a very, very substantial way, like the typology that you see Paul would use in other writings of the New Testament. And so that's very crucial. And also, like, just for a very annoying note, the idea of atonement is not present in that specific passage in Genesis. That passage has nothing to do with atonement, has nothing to do with sin. It only has, the only thing in the context that is talking about is obedience, how faithful Abraham is, how obedient Abraham is. And that's the whole point. And that's also how, if
you were to ask me, or if you were to approach me 2 years ago, and you were to tell me the stuff that you and I are now telling people, I would be like, are you crazy? Of course it's the substitutionary atonement. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? But if you actually think about it, what you just said is true. There's no atonement there. There's no mention of sin. There's definitely no mention of appeasing God's wrath. That's nowhere in Genesis 22. The ram that he offers is a Thanksgiving sacrifice. It has nothing to do with the atonement, like what you just said. So it's almost like people are under a spell. It's like they've repeated the same thing over and over. It's like a mantra. It's like you repeat it so many times and you think it's true, and then suddenly that's what you think. It becomes true to you, but it's actually not, right? It's like something you repeat over and over and over, and you just believe it. You just accept it. And it's, I guess, part of it is just how cultures work. It's a part of the cultural belief sphere of Western Christianity. That's just how it ended up, apparently. They ended up interpreting that as substitutionary atonement. But if you actually analyze the text carefully, and if you actually look at it for what it is, that is something that is read into it, which we call eisegesis, right? It's something eisegeted into the text.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again,
I think, yeah, go ahead.
A lot of questions, a lot of problems that people have with certain texts, and a lot of problems people have with certain concepts, is like a lot of things they are thinking comes from a scholastic perspective. Like they try to analyze things from a certain way of thinking. They try to see things through a certain way of thinking, certain analytical way of thinking, which is not how ancient people thought. It's not. That's like, even though scholasticism is fundamentally a form of Aristotelianism, Aristotle didn't think in a way that scholastics thought. So that's a very strong irony. We can get into those in the future episodes. But what I'm trying to say here is that people don't realize that how especially for the Western Christians, they don't realize that how scholastic their way of thinking is, how medieval their way of thinking is. Not everything Middle Ages are bad, but there are certain twists that depart them from the ancient culture, that separates them from how ancient people would think. And that's what's the problem here. So the questions, the problems they've raised, the questions they talk about, like, for example, a lot of apologetics talks about, like nowadays, talks about whether God existed or not. Well, that's a very scholastic question. Ancient people didn't have to think about this issue. Like the very question itself is putting God into a category of philosophical discussion. That's not how ancient people understood deity. Just like I would never put you in a framework of a philosophical discussion. That's just insane. How can you talk about people in a philosophical framework? But I guess in anthropology you have that. But you don't talk about a guy from a remote rural area and talk about him like whether he exists or not. What does he think in a very philosophical way? That's just insane. That's how ancient people will understand God. God is this real existence, like this reality people experience, and what they're trying to figure out is how to interact with this reality, how to interact with this person, rather than to analyze it. So questions like this are the concerns of later scholastic discussion. Like those discussions never existed before because they're not important. Ancient people didn't have these problems, and these are not the concerns of the apostles either, because they didn't think that we need to address those issues before people can have the true faith, before people can have the obedience to God. For one of the apparent reasons that they knew Jesus of Nazareth, they claim him to be God, and they didn't need to prove to people there is a guy called Jesus, because on the official record and of so many witnesses of that time, they knew that that was a guy who was crucified by Pontius Pilate in year 33 on the cross. Everybody knows it in Jerusalem. You don't have to prove anything. Like the idea of proving something through a logical deduction, that is very, very scholastic. And so that's one of the examples. I think that's another example how people will think in a way that is very different from ancient people. But my point is that if that's not the concern of the apostles, and if that's not the question the apostles are dealing with, if that's something that the apostles have already assumed, we should assume that too, and we should bear their mentality. We should concern what they are concerned of, and that's how we get into our salvation. That's how we can like work out our salvation. And it's not by figuring out the questions we want to figure out. It's not like we shouldn't try to make the scriptures to say something we are trying to say. But it doesn't mean that scriptures does not have answers to the questions we have. That's not the case. The scriptures do have answers to some of the questions we have. For example, to say the myth of evolution told us that men are not created by God. Alas, that's not they are not the only ones who said that. Ancient Gnostics also said that God did not create man. So the scriptures do have the answer for that, because in the very opening chapter of Genesis, it claimed that God created man. It's so clear. It's there. The scriptures do have some answers, but the scriptures are not written to specifically answer our concerns. They have other concerns that we need to be concerned of. If God created man, what is the duty of man? And that's the concern of the scriptures. And that's how we should think of when we approach faith, when we approach scriptures, when we approach salvation. Without those mentalities, that would be very dangerous, because we will think that scriptures answered my questions, and they gave me some answers, and I solved my problems, I solved my issues, but it doesn't bring me salvation. I think it does, but that's not true. I'm just deceiving myself, because I'm not working on the things that scripture expect me to work on by what it's written down. So that's the danger. That's the real danger, like very real spiritual and practical danger we are facing here.
You know, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that's a great segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that's, you know, our reason for making the book and for putting this out. You know, we have our own things going on in life, right? You know, there's other things we could be doing, but we took the time to put this book together, and we're trying to publicize it and publicize this message, and we're even making it free. We're doing all this because we think that the gospel is the single most important thing in this world, and the correct understanding of it can have eternal consequences, right? And so we really believe that this understanding, if it's understood properly, will bless you. And so that is why we have decided to put the book together, and why we're trying to get this message out. For me, it has been such a huge personal shift in my own life. I mean, the journey and the story behind the book has significantly changed my life. It's changed my perspective on Christianity, on the world. It's changed my walk of faith. Before I came to the understanding, with the help of James Doleman here, that led to the book, I thought Christianity was all in my head. It's something that you just believe, you give mental assent to, you believe up here, and once saved, always saved, right? As long as you believe, you're good. As a result of your belief, you should do good works, but I mean, if you don't, that's kind of a gray area. But actually, the gospel is something completely different than that. Like, that is so foreign to the original true message of what the gospel is. As you said earlier, the gospel should be more understood in like this military type of language. It's the good news. It was used of the emperor. The evangelion, that term was used when the Roman emperor came back for a triumph from conquering his enemies. And so it's used for Jesus because he is the king who conquered sin, death, and the devil. And by living in obedience to Jesus and doing the works he commands us to do, we can conquer them just like he did and escape the dungeon, right? We have a whole chapter about the dungeon in our book.
Yes.
So yeah, again, just to sum that up, I'm sure I speak for both of us whenever I say that the gospel we really believe is the single most important thing in this world. And so that's why we want to share it with people. So those are my closing statements for this video. Do you have anything to add to that, James?
I think I have nothing to add now.
Okay, all right. James, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me for this video. So our book is set to be published by the end of this year. Is that right? Is that
Yes,
deadline
yeah.
still set?
Yes, that's right. Our book will be formally published by former publishers, Orthodox publishers, by the end of this year. It's already blessed by a priest, and we are hoping that the bishop will bless it. And that's why we need more response, more feedback, and we can revise it, make it really a book that we really hope that this book will speak to people. Like, we really hope that the book will not just we're not just like barbling our own like opinions. We try to speak to people, actually have dialogue with people to help people to understand the conclusion we've come to, and we really want to like contribute to people's understanding on the gospel. And like Philip just said, that gospel is the single most important event in the whole universe, in the entire history of the universe, in the very reality that we're living in, this very moment, this very second. So we want to present it well, and we want to be responsible, and we want it to be like a book of the people. Like, people can read it and understand what we are talking about, and the book will really be speaking to them.
Awesome. Thanks, James. I wanted to share something with you. You mentioned just our babbling. It's kind of funny. I was sharing the book on some Facebook groups, and there's one Facebook group called Christian Apologetics, right? And so I commented about the book on there, and then some random person who was apparently a top contributor in the group, he commented and he said something like, Jesus is not divine. And then he like gave some reasonings and tried to evangelize me. And I said, isn't this a group for apologists?
Yes.
And then he said, oh, yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, I'm being an apologist. And then I said, but you just said Jesus isn't divine, sinned. And he said, well, I'm being a Christian because, you know, I'm trying to share the truth, right? And it's all about the truth. And he quoted a random Bible verse. And so, and then I was like,
So
hang on a second, there's
he's
something not quite right here.
so his Christian
and
faith
I
is
said,
that Christ is not, his Christology is like
so I
the non-divine Christ.
replied, so are you an apologist for the divine Jesus or for the Arian Jesus or something else? And so apparently in that group, there's a bunch of just random people who are heretics or who have heretical views. Apparently, like they're not real apologists.
Yes.
You know, it's like, what in the world? Like, what apologist? You know, what apologist would say Jesus is not divine? So, but of course, you know, there's always trolls too. But I get the feeling this guy was serious. Like, I guess it's kind of hard to tell, but he seemed like he was pretty serious. Anyways, I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah. So yeah, we are not just giving random babbling. We have tried to show the consistency in the system of orthodoxy, as we've tried to show that the Orthodox theology as a system is consistent. It's consistent with biblical teaching. It's consistent with the meaning of the ancient languages, Greek and Hebrew, of the original the Bible, and it is consistent with the cultures that stand behind the authors of the biblical text. And you know, if someone finds something that seems like it's not consistent, I mean, of course, we don't have perfect knowledge of everything, right? But the question then becomes, which system is more consistent, right? And I think what you'll find is that the answer is that the Orthodox system is most consistent compared to the Protestant or the Catholic theology. To put it in a negative way, the Protestant system is the least consistent.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, you know, there always may be some wrench that gets thrown in the gears that makes it seem like, you know, the whole machine's going to shut down. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, what is the most consistent? And so we have come to the conclusion that is orthodoxy, and that is what we present the book. So thank you for listening. That is all we have for this video. Join us again next time for the next one.